Hey there, welcome to my channel. This is episode 5 of the Spanish-American War. By the late 19th century, the United States had grown into an industrial powerhouse. But its military experience had largely been limited to conflicts on its own soil or just across its borders. That changed in 1898, when a small war in the Caribbean and Pacific announced America's arrival as a global power. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was a full-blown imperial power. It had annexed vast territories in the Pacific and the Caribbean. It had also acquired overseas colonies like Hawaii and Alaska. Yet the U.S. had never fought a war outside of North America, and most Americans had little interest in testing their military strength far from home. But that all changed with the war with Spain. The spark came from Cuba, which had long been under Spanish colonial rule. For over 3 centuries, Spain had ruled the island with an iron fist. Cubans chafed under harsh restrictions and sought greater freedom and autonomy. Tensions grew throughout the 1890s, culminating in a full-blown war for independence. And as the conflict raged, American newspapers, led by the sensationalist Yellow Press, fueled public outrage against Spain. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World ran stories of Spanish atrocities, many of them exaggerated or even invented, like this one depicting Spaniards putting Cuban cigars out on baby skin. Hearst famously told one of his artists, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Well, he may have been paraphrasing Mark Twain, but the papers did play a big role in whipping up public support for intervention. Then, on February 15, 1898, the U.S. battleship USS Maine, sent to Havana Harbor to protect American interests, exploded and sank, killing 266 sailors. While the exact cause was never definitively proven, American newspapers declared it an act of Spanish sabotage. The cry, "Remember the Maine," "To hell with Spain," swept the country. Within weeks, Congress declared war. It was a strange and controversial conflict, one that only a few Americans wanted and even fewer could locate on a map. The war was ostensibly about Cuban independence, but Spain wasn't going to give up its colony without a fight. The result was a clash between two evenly matched powers, neither of which really wanted to win. The war was fought in 2 theaters, the Caribbean and the Pacific. In the Caribbean, the U.S. sent a large fleet of warships and thousands of troops. They landed in Cuba in June and soon faced stiff resistance from the Spanish army. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey led the U.S. Asiatic Squadron into Manila Bay in the Philippines. At dawn on May 1, 1898, his ships opened fire on the anchored Spanish fleet. With the U.S. Navy outgunning and outmaneuvering its rival, the battle lasted only hours. By nightfall, Spain's naval presence in the Pacific was destroyed, and the Philippines fell under American control. So, although the main war effort remained in the Caribbean, the Pacific was a critical part of the conflict. As the war dragged on, public sentiment shifted. What began as a crusade to liberate Cuba turned into a full-blown campaign for empire. The cry now was Cuba Libre, Filipinas Mais, Puerto Rico Mais, meaning free Cuba, free the Philippines, free Puerto Rico. This was in no small part thanks to the efforts of the Yellow Press, which helped turn the Spanish-American War into a media sensation. Newspapers published dramatic stories and eye-catching illustrations, shaping public opinion and driving support for the war. The most famous image of the war, this one of Roosevelt leading the charge up San Juan Hill, is largely a product of yellow journalism. On July 1, 1898, American troops, including the volunteer cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders, charged up San Juan Hill near Santiago, Cuba. The unit was led by Theodore Roosevelt, whose fearless leadership and love of the camera made him a national hero. Roosevelt later wrote, "I don't care what they say about my appearance, I'm going to make a strenuous effort to look like a typical Western cowboy." He wore a distinctive outfit for the charge, a large Stetson hat, a buckskin shirt, riding breeches, and knee boots. His Kioma was a badge of office, symbolizing his status as a modern-day frontiersman. This charge up San Juan Hill was one of the most famous battles of the war. It was hot, chaotic, and deadly. Soldiers slogged uphill under a blistering sun, dodging Spanish bullets. Eventually, Roosevelt's men reached the crest, waving the flag in victory. The battle secured American control of the hills overlooking Santiago and marked a turning point in the war. By mid-July, Santiago Cuba's key port, had fallen. Spain sued for peace. The Treaty of Paris ended the war in December 1898. The United States gained control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and established itself as a major global player. But this new role also brought new responsibilities. The United States now had colonies to manage and an empire to defend. In the Philippines, a brutal guerrilla war soon broke out as Filipino independence fighters resisted American rule. The Filipino-American War would last longer than the Spanish-American War itself, ending in 1902. During the conflict, more than 200,000 Filipinos were killed, along with 4,000 Americans. For the men who fought, the Spanish-American War was short but intense. It was a war of heat, mosquitoes, and yellow fever. Fought in strange lands against a distant empire, there were only 130,000 American participants in the entire war. Of those, 100,000 were volunteers who had little military training and even less desire to fight in a faraway land. A common refrain among them was, "I came, I saw, I left." While casualties were light, the war took its toll. More than 5,000 Americans died from disease, and nearly 2,000 perished in combat. The war also left an indelible mark on the veterans themselves, many of whom returned home forever changed by their experiences. The Spanish-American War had thrust them onto the world stage, but at what cost? In the aftermath, many veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. They grappled with physical and psychological wounds, not to mention the moral complexities of fighting a war that most Americans didn't really want. Some found solace in veteran organizations like the American Legion, which provided support and camaraderie. But for others, the scars of war ran deeper, serving as a constant reminder of the cost of empire. The Spanish-American War is often remembered as a conflict of epic proportions, a clash between two superpowers that reshaped the global balance of power. But what if we told you there's another way to look at it? What if we suggested that this war was not just about battles and bloodshed, but also about something much more profound? The journey of a nation to discover itself on the world stage, from the steamy jungles of Cuba to the windswept shores of the Philippines. The Spanish-American War was a journey of self-discovery for the United States. It was a chance to shed its provincial skin and embrace its role as a global power. Through the triumphs and tragedies of war, the United States learned to navigate the complex world of international relations, forging alliances, managing rivalries, and confronting ethical dilemmas. It was a baptism by fire that tempered the American spirit, shaping a generation of leaders who would define the 20th century. So let us take a moment to remember not just the battles and bloodshed of the Spanish-American War, but also the journey of a nation that emerged from that conflict forever changed. Join me as we explore the triumphs, tragedies, and turning points that defined this pivotal chapter in American history, from the fiery crucible of San Juan Hill to the strategic brilliance of Manila Bay. Each battle was a step in America's journey to becoming a global power. We'll meet the heroes and villains who shaped the war, from the legendary Rough Riders to the cunning Filipino guerrillas. Discover how the war was fought, the tactics, technologies, and turning points that decided the fate of nations. And most importantly, understand why this war mattered, how it reshaped the global order, and set the stage for the 20th century. This is more than just a history lesson. It's an invitation to witness the birth of a superpower. Don't miss out. Be a part of this epic journey and discover the untold stories that have defined our world. All right, class dismissed. You want more information on the Spanish-American War? Check out the additional resources. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. In the early 20th century, Europe was like a pressure cooker about to explode. There were all these rivalries between countries, secret plans about who would help whom, and everyone wanted to be the biggest, strongest empire. It was only a matter of time before things popped. Then, in 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, got popped, literally. He was visiting Sarajevo when a Serbian nationalist assassinated him. Now this set off a chain reaction. Here's how it went down. First, Austria-Hungary was like, "We want to crush Serbia," and everyone else was like, "Okay, cool, not really. It's complicated." Basically, Russia was like, "No, Serbia is our buddy," while Germany was like, "Yeah, Austria, do your thing." France was on the fence, hoping this wouldn't turn into a big mess. And Britain was also like whatever. Initially, they did untake sides because this seemed like it could be one of those continental squabbles that usually fizzled out. But here's where things get really interesting. As tensions rose, countries started making secret deals. Britain and France made a pact, saying if either one got attacked, the other would jump in to help. They even drew Germany into this web of commitments. Meanwhile, Italy was secretly like, I'm with the Central Powers, but then switched sides later on. And Japan was like, hey, let's seize some German-owned islands in the Pacific. So basically, the assassination of one guy turned into a global mess. Now, the United States was initially like, y'all can sort this out amongst yourselves. We're going to stay neutral and not pick sides. But staying neutral wasn't easy. American banks were making tons of money by helping out the Allied powers, especially Britain and France. On the other hand, German submarines were sinking ships carrying goods to these countries, including American cargo. It was like a test of President Woodrow Wilson's policy of strict neutrality. Then, in 1917, everything changed. A German diplomat sent a secret message to Mexico proposing an alliance. If Mexico joined forces with Germany, they would help them win back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which Mexico had lost in the Mexican-American War. Talk about adding insult to injury. The U.S. intercepted this message known as the Zimmerman Telegram, and Americans were outraged. Plus, German submarines had resumed unrestricted warfare, meaning they were sinking everything, including American ships. So on April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany, and the U.S. was in. American soldiers who entered the war were part of the American Expeditionary Forces, or the AEF, under the command of General John J. Pershing. This wasn't like the small volunteer army the U.S. had during the Revolutionary War. No, sir. This time they were drafting millions of men. By the end of the war, over 2 million Americans had been drafted. That's a lot of people getting a crash course in military training. For most of these guys, Europe was a huge culture shock. They left behind farms and factories for cobblestone streets and centuries-old buildings. But there was nothing quaint or charming about the war-torn continent. It was messy, muddy, and dangerous. Some called it the Great War because it involved so many countries and continents. Others called it the war to end all wars, because it was just so incredibly destructive. When American troops arrived, they headed straight for the front lines. Their first taste of major combat was at the Battle of Cantigny in May 1918. Then, they jumped into the thick of things at the Anmarne Offensive. These battles were their baptism by fire, a crash course in trench warfare. The U.S. was there to fill the gaps left by exhausted British and French troops. But the Americans weren't just there to mop up. They were expected to hold key sections of the Western Front, sometimes on their own. One of the most famous American battles happened in June 1918 at Belleau Wood near Paris. This was a small patch of forest that had changed hands many times. It was a no-man's land between the trenches of the British and Germans. The U.S. Marines charged through machine gun fire to capture it. It was hand-to-hand combat in dense undergrowth. The Marines fought so fiercely that the Germans gave them a terrifying nickname, the Devil Dogs. The wood was eventually captured, but not without heavy losses on both sides. This battle showed that the Americans were here to play for keeps. But holding territory wasn't just about winning battles. It was about enduring the daily realities of trench life. The trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, a maze of muddy tunnels and cramped quarters. They were infested with rats, smelled terrible, and were a breeding ground for disease. But the real danger was outside the trenches, in no man's land. It was a blasted wasteland of barbed wire, craters, and corpses. Few who ventured there survived for long. Life in the trenches was a strange mix of boredom and terror. There were days when nothing much happened except for the occasional exchange of gunfire. Then suddenly there would be an artillery barrage, and everyone would scramble for cover. It was a game of cat and mouse between the soldiers and the elements. Rain, mud, and lice were constant companions. The soldiers devised ways to cope, playing cards, writing letters, or just talking to keep their spirits up. But mostly, they waited. They waited for the order to charge out of the trenches, to leave the safety of the tunnels for the deadly run across no man's land. Finally, in the fall of 1918, the Allies planned a massive offensive to end the war once and for all. It was called the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, and it was the largest operation in U.S. military history up to that point. Over 1.2 million American troops were involved. Their goal was to push through heavily fortified German defenses, which included machine gun nests, barbed wire, and perhaps most daunting, the enemy. This offensive was brutal. The Americans faced tangled forests, heavy rain, and relentless German resistance. One unit, known as the Lost Battalion, became surrounded for days without food or water. They were trapped in a pocket of land surrounded by the enemy. Eventually, they were rescued, but not without suffering severe losses. As the offensive continued, casualties mounted. Soldiers faced the constant threat of death, not just from the enemy, but from friendly fire. Artillery barrages often hit close to where the soldiers stood, and when supplies ran low, hunger and thirst became their enemies. Still, they pressed on. They fought through exhaustion, hunger, and fear, pushing toward the enemy lines. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was a turning point in the war. It weakened the German army, which was already on the brink of collapse. As the offensive dragged on, news of the Eastern Front added pressure. The Russians had made significant gains, and the Germans knew they had to stop the Americans. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. The fighting had ended. When the war ended, America had lost over 116,000 soldiers. That's a staggering number, but compared to the rest of Europe, it was relatively small. Still, it was a heavy price to pay for a nation that had never fought on such a scale overseas. The war had catapulted the United States onto the world stage. The old isolationist policies were washed away in the tides of global conflict. As the soldiers returned home, they brought with them stories that would forever be etched in American memory. They talked about the gas masks, the whistle that signaled the charge, and the eerie nights when the stars glimmered faintly over a world gone mad. The Great War had changed them, their country, and the world. And that's all she wrote for this episode. Thanks for watching. World War II was the most devastating conflict in human history. And yet, amid the atrocities of the Holocaust, the firebombing of Dresden, and the island hopping across the Pacific, there were moments of humanity, courage, camaraderie, and hope. Hey there, and welcome to this channel. Today we're looking at what Americans took home from World War II. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. By the late 1930s, much of the world was in turmoil. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had conquered much of Europe. Fascist Italy had invaded Africa, and Imperial Japan was expanding across Asia and the Pacific. The United States, still weary from World War I, tried to stay neutral, but tensions grew. The breaking point came on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, sinking or damaging much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and killing over 2,400 Americans. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. The next day, America declared war on Japan, and soon after, on Germany and Italy. The war effort transformed America. Factories shifted from cars to tanks, from typewriters to machine guns. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Over 16 million Americans would serve in uniform. U.S. forces first saw action in North Africa in 1942, helping British troops push back German General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. From there, the Allies invaded Sicily and then Italy, battling up the peninsula against fierce German resistance. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. At dawn, thousands of American soldiers stormed Omaha and Utah beaches under heavy fire. Waves crashed, sand churned with explosions, and soldiers clawed forward through obstacles and machine gun nests. In December 1944, Germany launched a surprise counteroffensive in Belgium's Ardennes forest. Snow, bitter cold, and fog shrouded the battlefield. American troops, often outnumbered and undersupplied, held their ground until reinforcements arrived, turning the tide in the Allies' favor. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy struck back at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, sinking for Japanese aircraft carriers. From there, the U.S. adopted an island-hopping strategy, seizing key islands while bypassing others. On islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, American troops fought in brutal heat, through jungles and coral reefs, against an enemy that often refused to surrender. In February 1945, U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima, facing fierce resistance from Japanese defenders hidden in tunnels and bunkers. After weeks of fighting, 6 Marines famously raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, an image that became an icon of the war. Okinawa, the last major battle, was even bloodier. Kamikaze attacks, artillery bombardments, and close-quarters fighting claimed tens of thousands of lives. On May 8, 1945 V-Day, Germany surrendered. 3 months later, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, VJ Day. The cost was staggering. Over 400,000 Americans killed, millions wounded, and countless lives changed forever. But the war had also reshaped America, now a superpower with new global responsibilities. For those who served, World War II was the defining chapter of their lives. They remembered the friendships forged in foxholes, the long nights on watch, and the hope that each battle might be the last. They carried those memories home and into the new era they had helped create. Before we dive into some of those memories, let's take a look at how the war changed America. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was largely isolationist, but the war effort transformed that. Suddenly, America was at war on multiple fronts, and the government needed support. This led to the largest peacetime migration in American history. Over 6 million African Americans moved north in search of factory jobs and better lives. Women also filled roles previously unavailable to them, working in factories, shipyards, and offices. This economic boom had a lasting impact. No longer did people see women as too delicate for such work. After the war, many continued to pursue careers outside the home. The U.S. emerged from the war as a major player on the world stage. It had fought alongside allies like Britain, France, the Soviet Union, China, and India, forming bonds that would shape the post-war world. However, the war's end also brought challenges. How would the U.S. deal with the millions of veterans returning home? What would happen to the military-industrial complex that had boomed during the war? These questions would define the post-war era. The war also left its mark on Americans in more personal ways. For those who fought, they returned home with physical and emotional scars, not just from combat, but from the horrors they witnessed. The loss of innocence, the trauma of combat, and the constant threat of death left many struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Some turned to art, literature, and film to express their experiences, while others sought support from fellow veterans. Despite these challenges, Americans also returned home with souvenirs, mementos, and stories that would become family lore. They brought back items that symbolized their service and sacrifice, from dog tags and helmets to uniforms and weapons. These artifacts served as tangible reminders of their experiences and a way to connect with others who shared similar stories. But what did they take home in their hearts and minds? Well, here are some of the things Americans took home from World War II: camaraderie and brotherhood. War is often described as hell, and for those who fought in World War II, that was all too true. Combat is a terrifying and traumatic experience, but amidst the chaos and danger, bonds of camaraderie and brotherhood were formed that would last a lifetime. Soldiers fought side by side, relying on one another for support and survival. They shared rations, stories, and cigarettes around campfires, forging friendships that transcended race, class, and background. These bonds were a source of strength in the darkest of times, providing comfort and solace when things seemed bleakest. Veterans often spoke of their wartime friends with great affection, remembering the camaraderie and brotherhood they shared as one of the best things they took home from the war. For some, the war also brought unexpected friendships with those from other nations. Many American prisoners of war, particularly those captured early in the conflict, were held in camps for years. During this time, they developed relationships with their captors, sometimes sharing meals, playing cards, and exchanging personal items. While their experiences varied widely, some POWs formed genuine friendships with their guards, learning about their families, backgrounds, and perspectives on the war. These unlikely friendships offered a glimmer of humanity in a dark and challenging time, reminding us that even in the midst of conflict, empathy and compassion can prevail. Upon their release, some POAs struggled to adjust back to life in the United States. Finding it difficult to reconcile their experiences in captivity with their former lives, others remained in contact with their newfound friends from abroad, exchanging letters and gifts long after the war had ended. Patriotism. Patriotism is a complex and powerful emotion that can inspire great acts of courage, selflessness, and unity. World War II was a pivotal moment in American history, and for many, the war effort was a source of immense pride and patriotism. Serving in the armed forces during this time meant defending not only the United States, but also the principles of democracy, freedom, and justice, whether fighting on the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific. Americans were united in their determination to protect their country and its interests. The war also fostered a sense of national unity and solidarity, as citizens rallied together to support the troops and contribute to the war effort on the home front. From rationing food and supplies to purchasing war bonds, Americans of all backgrounds came together to support the cause. This spirit of unity and patriotism has had a lasting impact on American identity, shaping the country's values and character for generations to come. For many Americans, the war also brought a renewed appreciation for the blessings of liberty and democracy. Facing the horrors of war and oppression firsthand, they returned home with a deep sense of gratitude for the freedoms they had fought to protect. Disillusionment. World War II was a defining moment in American history, but it was not without its complexities. For some, the war effort brought disillusionment as they grappled with the realities of combat and the complexities of the global political landscape. The horrors of war and the loss of life left many questioning the true cost of victory, while the alliances and rivalries that shaped the conflict challenged their perceptions of right and wrong. Some veterans returned home disillusioned with the political and social issues that had divided the nation, while others questioned the role of war in achieving lasting peace and understanding. This disillusionment led to a period of reflection and reevaluation as Americans grappled with the legacies of the war and sought to create a better future for themselves and their country. For example, many African Americans who served in the armed forces returned home disillusioned by the persistence of racial discrimination and segregation. Despite their service and sacrifice, they continued to face discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations, leading to growing frustration and a desire for change. Similarly, some veterans of the Pacific Theater grappled with the legacy of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, questioning the necessity and morality of using such destructive weapons of war. This disillusionment fueled a movement for peace and disarmament as they sought to prevent the horrors of nuclear war from ever repeating themselves. Hope. Amid the horrors and hardships of World War II, hope was a guiding light for many Americans. Whether facing the uncertainty of combat or the challenges of the home front, hope sustained them through the darkest days of the conflict. The hope for a swift victory, the hope for the return of loved ones, and the hope for a better post-war world kept spirits high and determination strong. This sense of hope was evident in the artwork, music, and literature of the era, which often celebrated resilience, courage, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. As the war drew to a close, hope for a lasting peace and a brighter future inspired Americans to rebuild their lives and shape the world in new and positive ways. In conclusion, World War II was a defining moment in American history, leaving an indelible mark on the nation and its people. From the bravery and sacrifice of those who fought to the contributions of those on the home front, the war effort brought out the best in many Americans, fostering a sense of unity, patriotism, and resilience. However, the war also brought challenges and disillusionment as many grappled with the realities of combat and the complexities of the global political landscape. Despite the hardships, hope was a guiding light for many, inspiring them to persevere through the darkest days and strive for a better future. Ultimately, World War II left a legacy that continues to shape America today, from the sacrifices made on the battlefield to the contributions of those on the home front. The stories of those who lived through this era remind us of the strength, resilience, and hope that defined a generation. What did you find most interesting about how World War II affected the United States? Let us know your thoughts, and be sure to check out our other videos. Thanks for watching. Have you ever found yourself asking, how did we get here? Well, let's go back. Back to the beginning, back to the dawn of a new era, back to the start of the Cold War. It's June 1950. For decades, the world has waited for this moment. Now the bombs are falling. North Korean troops, backed by their new powerful ally, the Soviet Union, are surging south across the 38th parallel, driving the underprepared South Korean army before them. The nation's president, Syngman Rhee, appeals to the United States for help. And within days, President Harry S. Truman has committed American forces to the conflict. As the North Koreans advanced, a small band of less than 9,000 U.S. soldiers scrambles to the defense of the South. Soon they are joined by thousands more from around the world, all fighting under the banner of the United Nations. Together they face an advancing force of more than 100,000 troops. Over the next month, American and UN forces fall back before the onslaught. Many are killed or captured, others are wounded or exhausted. The defenders can't hold any of the territory they've been ordered to secure. They reforced to fall back to a small defensive line around the port city of Busan in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula. Here, stretching 140 miles along the coast, they dig into one of the largest beachheads in history. It is August 1950, and the defense of the Busan perimeter will soon become one of the most desperate battles of the Korean War. For 3 weeks, the defenders have hunkered down, watching the North Koreans amass thousands of artillery pieces around their positions. Day after day, the enemy bombards the beaches, hurling high-powered shells into the Allied lines. But the attackers cannot break through. The tide begins to turn when the Americans discover a large number of North Korean infiltrators crossing the heavily mined beaches at night, seeking to enter the perimeter undetected. Defenses are strengthened, and then the real fighting begins. On August, the North Koreans attack. Theirs is a massive assault. Wave after wave of soldiers pressing against the defensive lines. Fighting rages throughout the day. Tracer rounds rip through the air. Explosions rock the landscape. Small arms fire crackles incessantly. Men charge forward, firing their rifles, only to be cut down by withering machine gun fire. Companies launch frontal assaults against seemingly impenetrable machine gun nests, but time after time, they take heavy casualties and fail to secure their objectives. By the end of the day, both sides have suffered heavy casualties and the fighting continues through the night. Sleep is forgotten as the defenders hold on to every inch of ground, repelling one attack after another. Artillery barrages crash into the ranks of the North Korean attackers, sending men and equipment flying. But still, the attacks continue. It's August, and the fighting continues unabated. The Americans are holding on, but the North Koreans won't stop attacking. Wave after wave crashes against the defensive lines, each one more determined than the last. It seems that the defenders may soon be overwhelmed, but just as it appears that the North Korean attacks will succeed, reinforcements arrive. Fresh troops race to the front to take up positions in the battered lines. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the attack slows and eventually stops. The Americans have held. The casualties have been staggering, but the perimeter remains intact. The North Koreans have not broken through. The long, hot days of summer turn into long, cold nights. Temperatures drop, rain falls, and the men grow weary. Still, they know that they must hold. If the perimeter falls, the war may be lost. They fight on, holding to their posts, manning their guns, waiting for the next attack. It seems endless, but finally, after what feels like an eternity, the rains stop and the clouds break. A cool breeze sweeps across the peninsula, bringing with it the promise of a new day. The fighting has stopped, and hope returns. From their beachside encampments, American commanders watch the North Korean left flank moving away from the perimeter. At the same time, their right flank is pushed forward, probing for weakness. Seeing his opportunity, General Douglas MacArthur makes a decision. His forces will attempt a daring counterattack. They will land troops far behind enemy lines at Incheon, a heavily fortified North Korean port city located 200 miles behind enemy lines. There, with the help of extreme tides, they will seize key hills overlooking the harbor. Then they will race inland, severing North Korean supply lines and forcing the enemy to flee. The plan is audacious, even reckless, but it's the best chance the Allies have to win the war. And so on September 15, 1950, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Incheon. Their landing is a stunning success. Within hours, they have secured the key hills overlooking the harbor and are racing inland toward Seoul, the North Korean capital. The liberation of Seoul is met with joy and celebration. Families pour into the streets, cheering and waving. The Marines have struck a decisive blow against the North Koreans, and the tide of the war is turning. But it's not over yet. The Marines are pushed back by strong counterattacks, but they hold their ground. They fight fiercely to repel wave after wave of North Korean soldiers. Finally, the attacks subside, and the Marines are able to regroup. Then they push forward again, driving the North Koreans before them. They move quickly, racing north toward the Yellow River, which forms the border between North and South Korea. By late November, American forces have advanced nearly 150 miles north of Seoul. But there's no celebration here. The advance has been costly, and the North Koreans seem determined to stop the U.S. advance. In fact, something much larger is on its way. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops are pouring across the Yalu River from China. Their presence signals a major change in the conflict. No longer will the U.S. face only North Korean forces. Now they must contend with an entire new army, and so begins one of the most bitter chapters of the Korean War, a struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. American and UN forces find themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket of territory in the east. Chinese troops press hard, driving the defenders back. Slowly the pocket shrinks until only a few miles remain. Trapped inside, tens of thousands of US and UN troops desperately fight to escape. The situation is critical. Supplies are low, and the enemy shows no signs of letting up. As the front lines converge, the defenders prepare for a final stand. But just as it seems all hope is lost, the Chinese attack falters. The US and UN forces are able to hold their ground. The fighting rages for days, but slowly the pressure begins to ease. The defenders have held, but they're badly mauled. The North Koreans exploit the situation, pushing forward and threatening to encircle the remaining Allied forces. The US and UN troops fight back, slowing the advance and buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Eventually, the front stabilizes, ending the threat of encirclement. The fighting continues, but now the pace is slower. Both sides dig in and prepare for a long siege. For months, the front line remains virtually unchanged. The fighting becomes a grinding war of attrition. Patrols clash in the hills, artillery duels rage across the landscape, and small unit assaults take heavy casualties. The fighting is brutal and the losses are heavy, but neither side is able to break through. By mid-1951, the war has become a stalemate. The front has stabilized near the original dividing line at the 38th parallel. The fighting continues, but there is little hope for either side to achieve a decisive victory. Desperation grips the Americans. The fighting has been long and costly. Morale is low, and the end seems nowhere in sight, but the U.S. is determined to hold. They dig in and prepare to fight another year. And so, the war drags on. It becomes a battle of wills. Neither side is able to break through. The fighting continues, but the intensity has lessened. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice is signed. The war is over. The border remains almost exactly where it had started, but South Korea has survived as a free nation. The Korean War is one of the most important conflicts of the Cold War era. It was a clash between communism and democracy. It was a test of wills between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a war of necessity for the United Nations. It was a war to protect freedom. The Korean War was also a war of extremes. It was a war of blistering summers and frozen winters, of sudden ambushes and relentless uncertainty. It was a war fought by young men who had never seen combat. It was a war of heroism and tragedy. For those who fought in Korea, it was a war they never forgot. It became known as the Forgotten War, but the men who served remembered every hill, every comrade, every night spent wondering if dawn would come. They say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if that's true, then the music playing in the late 1940s should have warned us about the tune we'd be forced to dance to in the next few decades. After the Second World War, colonial empires that survived the conflict started to fall apart. One such victim was French Indochina, which included Vietnam. Vietnam, along with Laos and Cambodia, had been held by the French since the mid-1800s. It was a relationship that never really worked, while Vietnam had become a key part of the French colonial apparatus. Supplying raw materials for its industrial might, it never really accepted French rule. From the early 1900s, Vietnamese nationalists had been organizing against their colonial masters, something that only intensified during the Second World War. After Japan entered the conflict and the French fell, many Vietnamese nationalists switched sides. They didn't fight for the Allies, but they did fight against the French. So when the Japanese occupation ended in 1945 and the country was handed back to the French, trouble was brewing. A leader of the nationalist movement named Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence and established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam with himself as its president. Of course, this was all rather inconvenient for the French, who wanted their colony back. So war broke out, the First Indochina War. And here's the thing. Although it was technically a war of decolonization, this was not your typical David and Goliath story. The Vietnamese were fighting with heart and determination, but the French were suffering from a serious case of post-war fatigue, and they weren't willing to commit the manpower necessary to win. Plus, they had a whole load of international prestige to protect. The way they saw it, losing Vietnam would be a blow not just to French pride, but to the standing of all European colonialism. So they asked the United Nations to mediate. The result was the Geneva Accords of 1954, which split Vietnam along the 17th parallel with Ho Chi Minh running the north and a U.S.-backed authoritarian regime running the south. The plan was to hold elections in 1956 to reunite the country, but that never happened. The two sides couldn't agree on anything, least of all, who should get to run the country. And so the stage was set for a brand new conflict. The U.S. was caught up in a global battle against the spread of communism. And with their ally, the government of South Vietnam, looking shaky at best, the Americans were committed to keeping the dominoes from falling. However, for all their military might, the U.S. wasn't able to replicate the success it had in previous wars. This was a different kind of battlefield. The terrain was thick jungle and swampy terrain. It was hard to navigate and even harder to flush out an enemy from. This was a place where conventional warfare didn't work, and the U.S. wasn't used to fighting that way. Making matters worse, the communist-led Viet Cong knew the land like the back of their hands. These were people who grew up in the Vietnamese countryside. They used hidden tunnels, booby-trapped paths, and well-timed ambushes to devastating effect. Then there were the river systems that crisscrossed the Vietnamese countryside. They were supposed to be a boon for the North, providing easy transportation routes and access to food-rich areas. But they soon became a curse as the South used them to launch surprise attacks. Things were bad enough for the U.S. military, but for the Vietnamese people, the war was a disaster. Villages were evacuated, crops were destroyed, and medical care became almost impossible to find. The war zone quickly became a no-man's land. The Americans could see that things were going wrong, and they tried to fight back. They introduced new tactics like saturation bombing, where they dropped huge numbers of bombs over a small area in an attempt to wipe out entire battalions of the enemy. But these proved ineffective against the elusive Viet Cong, and they caused huge amounts of destruction and loss of life. The Viet Cong had become a serious problem, and the U.S. needed a way to stop them. That's when the Pentagon began searching for solutions in the sky. As it turns out, there was a lot you could do once you got there. American troops patrolled the jungle floor in oppressive heat, constantly wary of booby traps. Meanwhile, above them, helicopters buzzed, offering a lifeline into the heart of the action. Suddenly, it was possible to reach remote zones in minutes instead of days. Wounded soldiers could be whisked away from the battlefield, and entire battalions could be deployed on the double. For the first time in history, war was being waged in 3 dimensions. No longer were soldiers stuck on the ground or locked behind fixed fortifications. Now they could travel vertically through the skies, appearing seemingly out of nowhere. The helicopters were also equipped with rockets and machine guns, adding another layer to the air war raging above Vietnam. They provided close air support to ground troops, adding firepower to the mix. But perhaps the greatest impact was the speed and flexibility they offered. Troops could be deployed wherever and whenever needed, turning the tide of battle in a matter of minutes. They cut through the thick jungle canopy, landing troops deep within enemy territory before swooping back up into the sky, leaving nothing but the sound of worry blades and the echo of gunfire. They became symbols of the new face of war, hovering like metal dragonflies amidst the swirling chaos, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the choppers disappeared into the twilight, returning to base, ready for another day of fighting in the skies of Vietnam. But not all the action was in the air. The helicopter carried 4 exhausted American soldiers into a clearing in the heart of the Vietnamese jungle. It was November 1965, and they were part of the 1st Cavalry Division, better known as the Air Cav. Their mission joined the rest of their unit in the Ia Drang Valley to engage a North Vietnamese Army battalion. What followed became known as the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley. It was a clash unlike any other, a showdown between two very different kinds of armies. With orders to take out the NVA battalion, the 1st Cav deployed, their helicopters disappearing into the thick tree line. Moments later, hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers opened fire. It was a scene straight out of a Hollywood action film. Helicopters descended into a hail of bullets, their rotors kicking up dust and debris around them. The soldiers quickly unloaded their gear and opened fire, their rifles spitting out bullets that tore through the thick foliage. But this wasn't a movie. There were no stunt doubles or editing tricks. This was real life, raw and unforgiving. And as the smoke cleared, the Americans realized they were in for a fight. In the end, the Americans managed to drive the NVA back, proving the power of air mobility and delivering a significant victory. But it came at a cost. They suffered heavy casualties. Some were killed, others injured. The event marked a turning point in the war, showcasing the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. The Americans demonstrated the incredible capability of their air mobility strategy, swooping in and out of the valley with relative ease. But they were forced to recognize the tenacity of their enemy. The North Vietnamese army fought fiercely, inflicting heavy casualties on the Americans, despite being outnumbered. It was a stark reminder that this was not just a quick military operation. This was a war that would test the mettle of both sides. The helicopter carried more than just soldiers. It carried hope, medical supplies, food, and a promise of rescue. Each rotation brought fresh troops and resources into the fray, helping the Americans stay engaged in the dense Vietnamese jungle. But with every passing day, the war became more complex. On January 30th, 1968, that complexity exploded into one of the darkest chapters of the conflict, the Tet Offensive. It was the Vietnamese New Year, a time for family, feasting, and fireworks. But for the South Vietnamese and American forces, it became a nightmare. As communist forces launched a series of surprise attacks across the country, cities and bases alike were thrown into chaos. For the Americans, it was a shock. They had been led to believe that the Viet Cong were on the run. Yet here they were, launching a full-scale offensive. It was a harsh lesson in the unpredictability of war. Amidst the chaos, American helicopters whirred to life, their blades beating out a frantic rhythm as they raced to deliver troops to the besieged areas. The Tet Offensive was a turning point. It shattered any illusions of a swift victory and underlined the tenacity of the Viet Cong. The war was far from over, and as the Americans dug deeper into the quagmire, they found themselves facing not just an army, but a nation. The Tet Offensive left its mark on the hearts and minds of the American public. The constant stream of casualties coming out of Vietnam began to erode public support for the war. It raised questions about the true nature of the conflict and whether America's involvement was truly in its best interest. Television brought the reality of war into American living rooms, shattering the distance created by earlier wars. The image of Hue being bombarded of villages in flames, of desperate civilians fleeing for safety, all seared themselves onto the retinas of American viewers. It was a visceral experience that humanized the war, making it feel all the more immediate and real. As the body count rose and the fighting dragged on, a sense of unease began to spread across the United States. People questioned the war's purpose, the methods used, and the toll it was taking on their sons, their brothers, their fathers. The war, once supported by the majority, now faced growing opposition. Protests erupted on college campuses and peace rallies drew tens of thousands into the streets. The polarization deepened, dividing families, friends, and neighbors. It was a stark contrast to the unity that had prevailed during the Second World War, a reflection of a nation grappling with its role in a conflict that seemed to have no clear end. Throughout the war, the helicopter was a constant presence. It flew through storms and over treacherous mountain ranges, connecting isolated troops to the wider war effort. But as the years passed, its role evolved. As the war became increasingly unpopular, the choppers took on a darker role, ferrying casualties away from the front lines, sometimes to hospitals, but more often to memorials. Each flight was a somber affair, the whir of the blades taking on a mournful tone as they carried not just wounded soldiers, but the weight of a nation's grief. With each rotation, they brought back stories of valor, of tragedy, of lives cut short and dreams left unrealized. The helicopter, once a symbol of American might, now symbolized the heavy cost of war. By the 1970s, the war had become a quagmire. Despite the introduction of new technologies and tactics, the Americans found themselves bogged down in the dense jungles of Vietnam. The enemy was elusive, striking from hidden positions and melting away into the dense foliage. Even the introduction of attack helicopters and other advanced aircraft could unturn the tide decisively in America's favor. The North Vietnamese army was well-trained, well-equipped, and fueled by a strong sense of nationalism. The relentless pressure mounted by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong slowly drained the American resolve. The war became a stalemate. The jungle became a graveyard of tanks, helicopters, and dreams. Finally, on January 27, 1973, after 8 years of bloody conflict, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement led to the withdrawal of most U.S. troops and a ceasefire across the country. But the fighting continued. Just 2 years later, on April 30, 1975, the North Vietnamese entered Saigon, ending the war. The Vietnam War wasn't just a military conflict, it was a cultural clash, a battle of ideologies, a struggle for national identity. It pitted superpowers against guerrilla armies, traditional values against modern warfare, and it left an indelible mark on everyone involved. When Washington's troops arrived at Valley Forge in December of 1777, they were close to collapse. It was one of the most brutal winters on record, and they were without adequate shelter or supplies. Over the next 6 months, though, they rebuilt themselves into a viable fighting force, ready to take on the most powerful army in the world. What follows is a dramatization of events based on historical records. Some historians debate the extent to which this event actually took place, but we do know that George Washington recognized the need to improve his army's ability to forage and find food in the wilderness. This was a key skill for anyone trying to survive in the frontier regions of colonial America. His solution was to set aside 1 hour each day for his troops to practice foraging. The results were disastrous. Washington described his soldiers as being unfit to be soldiers, so poor indeed that many of them could not tell a hoe from a gun, much less use it. After 3 weeks, he gave up on the idea and reverted to issuing rations. A few weeks later, however, with supplies critically low in spring just around the corner, he tried it again. He organized the soldiers into groups of 6, with each man responsible for finding enough food for himself and the 5 other members of his group. If you couldn't get enough food for yourself, too bad. But if you brought back food for the rest of your group, you would receive double rations when it was available. At first, the results weren't great, but after 3 weeks, there was an improvement. Some men had learned how to forage and were bringing back enough food for themselves and their groups. The system continued until the end of April. By then, almost half of Washington's soldiers had become proficient foragers, and the rest still hadn't figured it out. Washington believed that 1 hour a day of training was more valuable than any amount of issued rations. He sent word to the Marquis de Lafayette to let him know that he had reorganized his army. Then he waited for the British to attack so he could show off what his men could do. 2 weeks later, British Lieutenant General Charles, Lord Cornwallis, marched his troops into the valley. Most of Washington's men were busy foraging, but they were able to rally quickly and launch a surprise attack. The British were caught off guard and retreated. Washington had proven that his soldiers could fight, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Despite the win, Washington was more tired than ever. It was time to leave Valley Forge and march south to meet up with the rest of the Continental Army. Foraging wasn't the only thing that had changed at Valley Forge. George Washington had made sure that while his men were training, they also received some medical care, something they had not seen much of up until that point. Dr. William Shippen, who had taken over the Army Medical Department in the fall of 1777, set up a hospital near the main encampment and began offering treatment to the sick and injured. He also set aside 1 day a week for every camp to hold a parade, so he could examine every single soldier for signs of illness. Many of the soldiers were suffering from malnutrition, so Shippen and his assistants began offering nutritional supplements to help them regain their strength. They also vaccinated soldiers against smallpox, which killed many during the Revolutionary War. But the conditions at Valley Forge were harsh, and doctors were unable to prevent disease from spreading through the camps. Measles, mumps, and influenza swept through the army, killing hundreds. It became clear that the soldiers needed to move to a cleaner location. And in the spring of 1778, Washington led his troops away from Valley Forge and set up camp near Wilmington, Delaware. It was a long march, and the soldiers suffered greatly along the way. There were desertions, attacks by Native Americans, and skirmishes with the British. But when they reached their destination, they found a location where they could finally begin to recover. Food was plentiful thanks to the hard work of women who had volunteered to serve as camp followers. They kept the soldiers fed and cared for their clothing. The soldiers were finally able to repair their uniforms and even issue them new ones when necessary. They drilled and prepared for the upcoming campaign, and for the first time in years, they were ready to face the British head-on. The Continental Army might have lost many battles, but at Valley Forge, they forged something that would carry them through the rest of the war. They created a community of soldiers who were trained, equipped, and ready to fight back. Their experience at Valley Forge gave them the skills and confidence to turn the tide of the war. George Washington knew that winning the war would require more than military victories. It would require the support of the people, and in 1778, the Continental Army was ready to show America what they were made of. The Battle of Fort Necessity was fought on July 3, 1754, between the British colonial militia and a force of French regulars and Canadian militia. The engagement was part of the French and Indian War, a conflict between the British and French colonial empires for control of North America. The battle occurred near present-day Farmington, Pennsylvania, when a detachment of about 50 Virginia militiamen under the command of Major George Washington constructed a fort made of logs. The following day, a larger force consisting of French troops and their Native American allies arrived and demanded the surrender of the fort. When Washington refused, the French opened fire, beginning a 9-hour siege. Although the attackers outnumbered the defenders by nearly 4-1, they failed to capture the fort due to the inaccuracy of their muskets, which were not effective at the long distances involved. However, during the battle, one of the Virginia soldiers accidentally shot and killed another, and with ammunition supplies dwindling, Washington realized he could not hold out indefinitely. Therefore, he negotiated a surrender agreement with the French commander, the Chevalier de Levis de Bonaventure, under which the Virginians were allowed to withdraw with their weapons and baggage. Despite the outcome, the British viewed the event as a heroic stand against the French, and it contributed to growing tensions that eventually led to the American Revolution. The Vietnam War was a lengthy and divisive conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam and its southern allies against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war had deep roots, in part due to the legacy of French colonialism and the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War. As the U.S. became increasingly involved in the conflict, domestic opposition grew, leading to widespread protests and a deep societal divide. The war ultimately had a profound impact on American society, contributing to the end of the draft. The rise of the anti-war movement and a lasting impact on the role of the U.S. in world affairs, the conflict remains a significant and controversial chapter in American history. On June 19, 1968, a company of U.S. Marines landed in a small Vietnamese village called Hue. Their mission was simple: kill all the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers in the area. The Marines had intelligence that told them exactly where the enemy was, right down to the number of men and the type of weapons they had, and still, by the end of the day, not a single VC or NVA soldier had been killed. What the heck was going on? The problem was that the Marines weren't actually fighting against VC or NVA soldiers. They were fighting against civilians. The Marines had come under fire while conducting a search and destroy mission. This meant that they would go through each house in the village looking for anything suspicious. If they found anything or anyone that looked suspicious, they would shoot them. But since there were no actual enemy soldiers in the village, the Marines ended up shooting innocent people. This caused a lot of problems for the Marines because they had orders to avoid civilian casualties. If they were going to be in a war zone, they needed to know that the people they were fighting against were actually the enemy. So the Marines decided to change their tactics. Instead of going through the villages and shooting everyone they found, they set up an observation post on a hill overlooking the village. From here, they watched the village for several days, waiting for the enemy to show themselves. Eventually, the Marines saw some people carrying guns. They opened fire, killing several of the villagers. The Marines thought they had finally found the enemy, but it turned out they had killed several teenage boys who were playing with toy guns. The Marines were frustrated and confused. They knew the enemy was in the village, but they couldn't find them. the Marines decided to try one last tactic. They surrounded the village and told everyone to come out with their hands up. The Marines found a bunch of weapons, but there was no one to go with them. The Marines had just committed a massacre. After the massacre, the Marines were pulled out of the village and sent back to their base. They were given counseling and told that it was all in the line of duty. But many of the Marines never forgot what they had done. Some of the Marines were haunted by the massacre for the rest of their lives. Others turned to drugs or alcohol to help them forget. The U.S. government tried to cover up the massacre, but word got out and the public was outraged. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered an investigation, but it was inconclusive. The public was not satisfied. The My Lai massacre became one of the most infamous incidents of the Vietnam War. It was seen as a symbol of the brutality of the war and the futility of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The war had already been unpopular when the massacre happened, but it quickly became clear that the massacre would have a major impact on public opinion of the war. The U.S. government tried to keep the massacre quiet, but that only fueled rumors that the U.S. was hiding something. As more and more people heard about the massacre, the public outcry grew louder. People began to question why the U.S. was fighting in Vietnam at all. The My Lai massacre was a turning point in the Vietnam War. It made the war deeply unpopular and led to questions about the morality of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. It also led to changes in the way the U.S. military operates to try to prevent such a massacre from happening again. From the frozen encampments of Valley Forge to the sweltering jungles of Vietnam, the story of America's wars is the story of its soldiers. Each conflict left its mark on the nation, on its ideals, and on those who served. In 1777, the Continental soldier fought for a nation that did not yet exist. In 1863, the Union soldier fought to preserve it. In 1944, the GI fought to defend it on foreign shores. And in 1968, the young draftee fought in a faraway land where the cause was less clear, but the danger no less real.